September 3rd, 1907, East Texas. A date carved in the memory of a land that pretended slavery was over. It wasn't, not for the hands that still bled in the cotton fields, not for the women dragged behind doors after dark, not for the children buried without names. Caleb, born in bondage, raised in silence, 30 years without a word, because words were too small for what they did to his mother. They called it freedom. But when his father died, handless, when his mother's blood soaked into the dirt, Caleb tied a rope, then another, 10 in total, 10 overseers, 10 verdicts, each one hung from the same fig tree that once shaded their whips. This is the true story of Caleb of Texas, the man who turned a plantation into a pulpit and the rope into the Word of God. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. They found him at dawn, swinging. The wind caught his boots like they were leaves in a dying season. His neck twisted unnaturally, his eyes wide open, still begging. The fig tree, ancient and gnarled, held his weight like it had held many secrets before. No one touched the body, not yet, not until the preacher came down from the hill. But the preacher wasn't a man of God, not the kind they were used to. He didn't wear robes, he didn't carry a Bible. He carried silence and rope. The overseer's name was Harlan Griggs, the 10th man to dangle from that same tree in just under 5 years. A brutal man, worse than most, known for making the black workers kneel in gravel while he recited made-up scriptures before a lashing. But this morning, scripture was written in shadows, and the only sermon was the sway of his corpse. A crowd had gathered, workers, old folks, children with dust on their cheeks. Nobody wept. And then, from the far end of the cotton field, he came. Caleb, dark-skinned, heavy-shouldered, barefoot. He walked slow, like each step remembered someone else's pain, like the earth whispered to him. No one spoke to him. They never did, but they watched. He stopped 10 feet from the body, looked up, and for the first time in 30 years, he opened his mouth. One word, whispered like thunder. And that was enough to make the white men lock their doors, and the black folks fall to their knees, not out of fear, but out of something older, respect, memory, justice. But to understand that moment, we must go back, before the rope, before the silence, before Caleb became the preacher of the hanging tree. They called it Tres Montañas, though there were no mountains, only 3 wide mounds of dry earth that rose like graves under the Texan sun. The name came from the old slave days, when 3 men tried to run and were caught, buried alive up to their necks. The land remembered, even when the people were forced to forget. Caleb was born there in 1877, 12 years after Lincoln's pen dried. But freedom hadn't come with the ink. It came with new chains, contracts, curfews, and the sheriff's whip wrapped in law. His mother, Miriam, never called herself free. Freedom don't mean nothing if your child still eat from a pig bucket. She worked the cotton rows from sunup to after dark, hands raw, back bent. His father, Isaiah, once a blacksmith for Confederate troops, now shoveled shit for 5 cents a day and a place to sleep near the mule pen. They were called laborers, but their world hadn't changed, only the name on the collar. Caleb was a quiet boy, too quiet. Folks said he'd been touched by spirits. Others whispered he was cursed. He never cried when beaten, never screamed when burned by accident with hot kettle water at age 7. Just silence. But his eyes saw everything. He saw men being disappeared after questioning wages. He saw the straw-colored soil stained red behind the smokehouse. He heard the girls scream in the sugar barn and saw them walk out days later, broken in ways no doctor could fix. He saw what silence was worth, and he started saving it, stacking it, building it inside. Isaiah tried to teach him to speak. "Boy, if they think you dumb, they'll treat you worse." But Caleb just stared, until the night they came for Isaiah. It wasn't a mob, it didn't need to be. Just 2 men with badges, and a lie about a stolen saddle. He was taken in. 3 weeks later, his body came back in a pine box, killed in custody. His hands were missing. Miriam didn't scream. She just collapsed at the foot of the fig tree and sang one word over and over again. Name, name, name. Because Isaiah's name was gone, filed, buried, erased. No marker, no trial, no apology. And that's when Caleb changed. He began walking the fields at night, watching, marking. He started carving names into bark with a dull nail, names of those taken, names of the ones no one spoke of anymore. And every time someone vanished, Caleb carved. And every time he carved, the fig tree bled. They say the land swallows black names, but Caleb wasn't going to let it keep them. He was going to feed it something else, something heavier than silence, something with a neck and a rope. The fig tree would remember, and so would he. The cotton fields stretched to the horizon like a white ocean of ghosts. Every bowl was a wound, every row a scar carved into the back of a land that never healed. They called it the season of silence. 3 workers went missing in 1 week. No explanation, no funerals, just gone. Old Benny was first. He had skin like roasted coffee, hands like coiled rope. Once he walked with Frederick Douglass in stories, taught night school to freedmen under lanterns, though nobody ever spoke of those times now. When the mills demanded cotton, old Benny brought it. When crops failed, he patched roofs. His voice was cracked, hoarse, but alive. One night shift near the cotton presses, he loosed the cotton into sacks. The moon caught his eyes. By morning, Benny was gone. All they found was his hat, brim stiff with sweat, lying near the mill's gears, and a blood-stained rag, frayed and torn, stuffed in the cogwheel. No body, just the suggestion of dread. Josie May, 15 summers lived, twice as many dreams. She could spin tales with her laughter. She could outrun anger when the overseer came too close. She was always helping, mending clothes, giving water, singing scraps of hymns when none dared. One night, after sunset, she crossed the quarters to fetch water from the well. The moon was thin, stars were distant. She carried the bucket, humming. Nobody heard footsteps. Nobody saw who took her. At dawn, the bucket was found at the well's edge, empty. Her footprint stopped at the tree line. Then nothing. Then Eli, a boy 9 years old, small as a sparrow, curious as a fox. He called the white foreman sir, too loud, some said, burdening himself with respect that tasted like ash. One evening after work, he lingered behind the field line picking stray cotton bolls. A foreman shouted at him. The boy dropped the cotton. He said, "Yes, sir," too soft. That was enough. A hand slapped poverty into his cheek. Next morning, Eli was not there. The boots of white men were found in the doorway of the quarters, but no trail led out, as if the land swallowed him whole. The rumors began, soft as breath. Night riders, contract enforcers, men in badges, but none spoke loud. None named names. Fear hovered, heavy as night humidity, over every porch, behind every shuttered window. Mothers held their children close. Fathers walked stooped in the muttered prayers of the old faith. Keep us safe when dark comes. And Caleb, he began to dig, not with shovels, not yet, with eyes, with memory, with silence. By day, he worked the rows, picking cotton under a sky that burned. He watched the overseers, their boots stir dust, their commands sharp, their cruelty quiet but constant. He noted every absence, whose bed was empty in the mornings, whose laughter had vanished from the evening table. By night, Caleb walked. The moonlight slanted between cotton stalks, making ghosts of the plants. He followed trails, a dropped shoe by the barn, a blood spot near the smokehouse, a loose floorboard in the washroom. Once, he found broken laces in the grass, Josie May's laces. He tucked them in his jacket. One midnight, the fig tree called his steps. It stood at the edge of the Campo Negro, the quarters where the black workers lived. Its roots knotted deep, its branches heavy with age. Under its shade, Caleb knelt. He carved 3 names into its bark: Benny, Josie, Eli. His blade scraped, wood slivered like tears. The tree's bark wept sap, dark and sticky. Caleb pressed his palm into it, felt its pulse, felt its grief. He listened. The wind moaned through the fig leaves. Somewhere an owl hooted. There was a stirring, something alive. In the distance, the groan of horses, a lantern swinging across distant pasture. But no footsteps came near him. He stood, lines of grief etched across his face. He carried a rope that night, thick sisal, coiled low on his shoulder. He practiced knots, a noose, a slip knot, but he never used it then, not yet. The cotton waited, the land waited. Caleb carried his secrets like stones in his chest. Then came the night the earth itself seemed to tremble. A scream, soft and strangled, rose from the quarters, a woman's cry. 2 men armed with badges burst through the door of Aunt Ruth's cabin. Ruth was old, bent, with silver hair parted in the middle, a daughter of former slaves, known for kindness, for sewing quilts, for holding children when they cried. They dragged her out. Her thin arms flailed. She screamed something. No one could hear the words. The badge flashed. The whip cracked. Bones snapped. Morning came. Aunt Ruth's cabin was silent, but for the echo of her moans. Her ribs broken, body bruised. She lay on the dirt floor, her quilt stained red. Caleb held her hand, didn't speak, didn't cry, just pressed cool water to her lips, wiped sweat from her brow, and watched her skin bloom with purple shivers. She opened her eyes, and in the dawn's weak light, said one word. Why? Caleb had no answer, but he swore something inside himself. This land will not forget, not anymore. Then, one evening, the overseer came pacing near the quarters. He cursed the workers for dirt on clothes, for quiet mouths, for disobedient heads. He spat, he brandished his whip, He struck the ground. He threatened. No one moved. Caleb stepped forward. Nothing spoken, just presence. The overseer's whip paused in mid-air. The cotton fields all around seemed to hold their breath. It was the first time someone wronged by the overseer didn't flinch. The week closed with the disappearance of two more, Marcus and Little Joe. Both essential hands, both silenced. Their beds were empty, chores undone. Each cabin had its door burst open, but no blood, no body, just absence. And Caleb, already carving names, already holding rope, stood at the fig tree under moonlight. He carved Marcus. He carved Little Joe. The bark split. Sap trickled. His hands trembled, or perhaps because his heart trembled. He tied the rope loosely around a branch. He pulled lightly, testing weight, swing. Not for them, yet. Something within him hardened, like iron forged in flame. He knew, when cotton becomes coffin, words are not enough. The cotton fields had swallowed their people, their joy, their names. Now, Caleb was preparing something heavier than silence, something that would hang in memory, something with a neck, a rope, a preacher. The fig tree would remember, and so would he. They found the body at dawn. The fig tree groaned under the weight of a man named Silas Breck, the meanest of the overseers. A Civil War orphan raised on grit and punishment, Silas was known for breaking shovels over backs and saying it was the Lord's correction. His voice was deep, cruel, and constant, until now. Now he swayed, boots dangling, eyes bulging toward heaven, tongue split purple and lolling like a dead snake. The workers gathered slow. No one ran. No one screamed. Some covered their mouths. Others dropped to their knees, not out of grief, but awe, because something had changed. Pinned to Silas's chest was a page, torn from a Bible, a verse scrawled in dark ink. For they have sown the wind, and they shall reap the whirlwind. Hosea 8:7. The writing was shaky, but strong, ink blotched from rough hands. The paper fluttered in the morning breeze like a white flag of war. No one touched him, not until the sheriff came. Not until the sun was high and the fields whispered with nervous cotton. Sheriff Duncan arrived with sweat on his neck and pistol on his hip. He spat once, looked up at the swinging body and muttered, "Damn fool got himself killed." But no one believed that. Not really. Duncan asked questions. No one answered. He shouted. Silence. Then he turned to Caleb, the tall one, the quiet one. Caleb stood a few feet from the tree, arms crossed, eyes low, barefoot, shirt open at the chest. The sheriff stepped close, real close, too close, and said, "You hear anything last night, boy?" Caleb didn't flinch, didn't speak, just stared. Sheriff's smile twitched. "You gone mute? Or just thinking real hard on something you shouldn't?" Still nothing. Duncan stepped back, cursed under his breath, and rode off with the body. The fig tree stood heavy that evening. The workers passed it in silence, each one glancing up to the branch where the rope had bitten bark. A child asked her mother, "Who did it?" The mother hushed her fast. "Ain't no who, just what needed done." At the evening meal, whispers passed between mouths like broken bread. Some said spirits had come. Others believed it was the old root magic returned. A few said Isaiah, Caleb's father, had risen from the grave. But most looked at Caleb. And Caleb, he just sat, eating, silent, still. But inside, the sermon had begun. The next morning, workers arrived at the fields early. But they didn't start picking. They stood still, waiting. A new overseer, a man named Hammond, arrived late. Red-faced and jittery. He cracked his whip once and barked, "Get to work!" No one moved, until Caleb stepped forward. No words, just a look. And one by one, they bent to the cotton, but not out of fear, out of understanding. Caleb was no longer just a man. He was a signal. The land had chosen its mouthpiece, and it spoke in rope. In the days that followed, a strange order returned. Hammond stopped shouting. He didn't walk alone. The sheriff rode by more often, eyes darting. The foreman checked the cabins at night, but always in pairs. No one wanted to be the next sermon, and the fig tree waited. One night, old Aunt Ruth called Caleb to her porch. Her ribs still hurt from the beating, but her eyes were bright with something older than pain. "That rope you carry," she whispered. "It got scripture in it now." Caleb said nothing, just touched the scar on his wrist. Ruth reached into her lap and handed him something, a piece of charcoal. "When it's time, write their names. God might forget. We won't." Caleb took the charcoal, held it like a sword, then stood and walked back toward the tree. Because one sermon had been preached, but there were still 9 more names waiting, and the fig tree had room for every one of them. The summer heat came down like a punishment. The sun didn't rise, it attacked. By midday, the cotton stalks wilted, and the backs of the workers burned beneath wide-brimmed hats and sweat-stained cloth. Whips cracked less now, not because mercy had found its way to the overseer's hands, but because fear had. Since the hanging of Silas Breck, everything had changed. Hammond, the new overseer, tried to carry his whip like it still meant something, but his eyes twitched every time a shadow passed behind him. His voice cracked when he barked orders. He drank earlier in the day now, stayed closer to the bunkhouse. Even the sheriff had grown quieter. His visits turned into glances. His questions lost their teeth. Caleb? He spoke nothing, but everyone listened. When a man dropped from exhaustion, Caleb was the one who lifted him. When a woman returned from the big house with tears in her eyes, Caleb was the one who stood outside the door all night, watching, saying nothing. The workers began to move with him. When he stopped, they stopped. When he walked, rows opened. When he looked someone in the eye, they felt either protected or warned. Then came Hammond's mistake. It was August, a long, dry week, the kind of week where tempers swell like the riverbeds before a storm. One of the boys, Samuel, maybe 13, was slow picking cotton. His hands were raw, fingers trembling from an infected cut. He dropped a bowl, then another. Hammond saw. The boy flinched before the whip even came down. "Lazy little bastard," Hammond hissed. The lash hit Samuel's shoulder. He screamed, fell, tried to crawl away. That's when Caleb moved. He crossed the rows in silence, each step like a drum beat. Hammond turned, raising the whip again, and froze. Caleb stood there, still, no weapon, no word, just presence. The whip trembled in Hammond's hand. He lowered it, walked away. Caleb knelt beside the boy, lifted him gently, carried him to the shade of the fig tree, and the workers watched, all of them, even the ones too afraid to breathe. That night the fig tree waited, and Caleb returned. He didn't carve a name, not yet. He didn't tie the rope, not yet. He sat, back to the tree, rope coiled beside him, watching the quarter road, watching the moon rise, waiting. 2 days later, Hammond was gone. No one saw him leave. No one heard struggle. His bunk was empty, boots still there, hat still hung, his pistol missing. By dawn, his body dangled from the fig tree, but this time there was no verse, no page, no explanation. Only his pistol tucked in his waistband and his tongue bitten in half. The workers found him just after sunrise. Children were kept back. Women stared, then turned away. The older men nodded, slow, solemn, like a debt had been paid. Now it wasn't just fear that moved through Tres Montañas. It was belief. Caleb was no longer a mystery. He was a force, and the white men knew it. Sheriff Duncan came in riding fast, dust cloud behind him, 2 deputies at his side. He stomped through the quarters, shouted questions, shoved old men against door frames. No one spoke. Caleb stood in the path, just stood. The sheriff stopped inches from his chest. "You think you're untouchable?" he snarled. Caleb didn't blink. The sheriff looked at his men. They didn't move. He spat near Caleb's feet and walked away. That was the last time he came without a gun drawn. That evening, someone etched a phrase into the washhouse wall. "Whips break bones, not votes." Nobody knew who wrote it, but everybody knew whose shadow walked past as it dried. The fig tree bore another scar. The second branch was split, the bark torn from weight. Caleb touched it, whispered something only the tree could hear, then turned, because the sermons weren't over. Only 2 verses had been preached, and 8 more names still waited for the rope. By September, no one called it superstition anymore. Not after the 3rd man swung, not after the 4th. No snakes, no spirits, no bad luck, just justice, meted out one neck at a time, and always from the same place, the fig tree. Its branches bent heavier now, bark darker, roots deeper. It no longer shaded the quarters, it judged them. The workers began calling it the pulpit, and Caleb, he became the preacher, not by word, but by fire, by rope, by consequence. The 3rd was Deputy Lyle, one of Duncan's boys. He liked to ride through the quarters drunk, boasting how the law don't bow to shadows. He once fired a shot above a child's head for fun. Another time, he dragged a young man, Jeb, from his bunk for not tipping his hat. Then one morning, Lyle's horse came back without him, blood on the saddle. Later that day, folks found him, not hanging, crucified, tied to the trunk of the fig tree, arms spread, hands pierced with sharpened fence nails, his badge driven into his mouth. No verse, just a word carved into the bark behind him, false prophet. The sheriff didn't ask questions. He buried Lyle quick, without ceremony, and rode back to town before dusk. He never returned alone again. The 4th was Foreman Trent, known for short pay and long fists. He took food from the workers' rations and sold it in town, slapped men for speaking, spat at women for singing. He was found dangling by the barn rafters, upside down like a slaughtered hog, a piece of the payroll ledger stuffed in his pocket, his boots missing, his face smeared with molasses, drawing ants like judgment. Now the sermons had rhythm. A name would vanish from the white roster, a body would appear, a message left, and the fields would grow quieter, not peaceful, never that, but obedient. And the quarters? They started to move different. People rose earlier, worked cleaner, kept watch. Children were taught silence as prayer. Elders sat by doors with polished walking sticks, not for walking, When someone wronged another, there were whispers of consequence. A man who beat his wife once disappeared for 3 days, came back bloody, silent, never raised a hand again. The rope wasn't just for the overseers, it was for balance. Caleb's presence now carried ritual. He walked the fields each morning, touched soil, watched shadows, carried the rope slung across his shoulder like scripture. Some say he prayed at night, low, guttural moans that rose into chants. Others say he never slept, that he buried his voice in the roots of the fig tree. What is known? He carved names, not all of them out loud. Some he carried inside, each a sermon waiting to be preached. After the 4th death, the landowners gathered in secret. Colonel Ashcroft, owner of the plantation, sat with 2 neighboring men and the sheriff. They spoke of bringing in federal marshals, of burning the fig tree, of killing Caleb quietly, but they didn't act because they were afraid, not of Caleb, of what he had become, a symbol, a scripture, a mirror. Because when they looked at him, they saw not just justice, they saw every sin they'd buried deep. Now walking, now watching, now waiting. One Sunday morning, a visitor preacher from town came to the quarters, invited by the sheriff to calm things. He stood at the chapel, sweating through his collar, stuttering through a sermon on forgiveness and order. Nobody clapped. Nobody said amen, because Caleb was outside, standing beneath the fig tree, with the real scripture in his hand. And when the bells rang noon, they rang not for worship, but for warning. The workers began saying a phrase under breath, God speaks in rope now. And when the wind moved through the fig tree, it was hard to argue. Colonel Thaddeus Ashcroft was not a man easily shaken. He'd survived the war, the fall of the Confederacy, the betrayal of Reconstruction, and the rise of sharecropping as a new gospel for old masters. He held on to the Tres Montañas plantation with the grip of a dying god, tight, cruel, proud. But now, something had changed. The colonel was afraid. It began with dreams. He'd wake soaked in sweat, the sheets tangled like vines. Sometimes the fig tree stood in his room, branches scraping the ceiling, no wind, no sound, just the creak of an unseen weight. Other nights, he heard the voice of his father, long dead. Blood ain't no inheritance, son. It's a debt. He tried to drink the dreams away. Brandy, then whiskey, then laudanum. But the more he drank, the clearer the rope became, swinging in the dark behind his eyelids. Always 10 ropes, and always one left empty, waiting. By day, he paced the big house, hand trembling on his cane. The same house built by enslaved hands. The same parlor where his grandfather had sold children between cigars and laughter. The same staircase where his mother pushed a housemaid for walking too loudly. Now the walls whispered. Now the doors creaked with intention. Now the portraits looked down with judgment instead of pride. He summoned the sheriff. Kill the bastard, he said, voice low, eyes sunken. Caleb, hang him. Make it public. But Sheriff Duncan only shook his head. He's not alone no more. He's just one man. No, sir. He's 10 names deep now. Maybe more. You hang him, this whole place burns. The colonel cursed, slammed his cane against the floor, but the sound echoed hollow, like bones dropped into a dry well. That night, the colonel woke gasping. A noose lay at the foot of his bed. Not a hallucination, not a dream. Real, coarse rope. Smelled of sap and sweat. He called the butler. The man swore he hadn't seen anyone enter. No tracks, no broken windows, just rope, waiting. He tried to retaliate. Brought in 2 bounty men from Houston. White, armed, ruthless, paid in advance, told to cut the root before the tree spreads. They never made it to Caleb. By morning, the fig tree bore 2 new ornaments, not hung, just bound, wrists and mouths gagged with cloth, eyes rolled back in terror, still alive, pinned to their chests. You were spared. That was mercy. Try again. And the rope speaks. They left before noon, never returned. The colonel stopped leaving the house, boarded windows, locked doors, slept with pistol and a Bible under his pillow. He started to see Caleb in places he couldn't be. Outside the parlor, beside the well, under the old slave bell, just standing, silent, rope across his shoulder. One morning, he found words etched into his mirror. The fig tree knows your name. He tried to scrub them off. They wouldn't vanish, not until he broke the glass. His staff began to leave, first the younger ones, then the cooks. The housemaids whispered prayers in Gullah and refused to go near the west wing. The colonel was alone, with his walls, with his ghosts, with his dreams. And still, the 10th rope remained empty. He stopped sleeping, he stopped eating, and every night, just before the bottle took him, he'd stare at the ceiling and whisper, "Not me. I didn't swing the whip. I only held the land." But the fig tree didn't care, and neither did the rope. because Caleb didn't come for guilt, he came for balance. And the colonel, he knew what the weight of 10 ropes meant. It meant justice had a ledger. And his name was the final entry. The border was no longer marked by fences. It was marked by fear. A mile out from the fields of Tres Montañas, people began to whisper. 2 miles out, they crossed themselves. 3 miles out, they turned back. The fig tree had become a monument. Caleb, its preacher, and the land, a sanctuary of unsanctioned justice. No law, no court, no plea, only rope and memory. The colonel, desperate and unraveling, sent word to Waco County militia. Paid with what gold and cotton he had left. Promised land, promised glory, promised that Caleb was just a man. They sent 7 riders, all white, all armed, all smiling. They arrived at night, torches high, pistols polished, riding stallions like they were crusaders. But the people didn't run, didn't scream, didn't beg. They stood, quiet, at the edge of the quarters, waiting. Eyes on the riders, eyes on the tree. And Caleb, he wasn't in sight, not yet. The captain dismounted, cocky, called out, "We've come to reclaim this land for order." No response. He aimed his rifle at the fig tree, fired a shot. The bullet struck bark. Sap leaked like blood. The wind rose, and that's when they heard it. Rope, tightening, swaying. Somewhere behind them, they turned and saw it. 2 of their own, already hanging, silent, no struggle, pinned to their chests. Here lies the last men who thought God ruled this place. The captain dropped his rifle, mounted fast, but his horse refused to move. The workers watched, still silent. Then from behind the fig tree, Caleb stepped out. No weapons, just the rope over his shoulder, and the fire of 7 sermons in his eyes. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The captain rode hard, left the rest behind. By morning, 5 horses wandered back without riders. Only the captain made it out. He never spoke of what he saw again, not once. From that day forward, Tres Montañas was untouchable. No more overseers came. No more soldiers, no more sheriffs. Even the white folk in town said it. You go past the fig tree, you on your own. The land had been claimed, not with parchment, not with politics, not even with prayer, but with 10 ropes and 1 man's silence. The workers began calling the place Terra Justa, just land, no master, no chains, no whips, only the law of balance and the weight of memory. Caleb no longer worked the fields, he walked them. The children called him, "O Silent Shepherd." The elders called him Son of the Tree. The land knew him as something older, something holy and dangerous. A preacher came from town, weeks later, Bible in hand, said he came to restore the Lord's word to the plantation. They met him at the border. Caleb stood with rope in hand, didn't speak. The preacher turned around, because at Tres Montañas, not even God ruled now. The fig tree had 10 names carved in its flesh, but Caleb had always known. Only 9 had fallen. 1 still breathed. 1 still walked. 1 still remembered the screams and smiled. And the land had not yet taken him. It began with a smell, a faint sweetness, rot and iron, the kind that lives in floorboards and never quite leaves. Caleb was walking behind the old laundry barn, a place no one used since the war. The sun was dipping, casting long shadows across the brittle grass. He stopped beside the warped wooden wall, stared down at the dirt. The grass there grew brighter than anywhere else, greener, as if the ground had been fed. He knelt, dug with his hands, slow, careful, remembering. First came cloth, buried shallow, ripped, molded, but familiar. A strip of faded blue with tiny white stitching along the hem. Stars, a dress, his mother's dress. Miriam had worn it the night they took her. Caleb was 10. He remembered the lantern light flickering outside the cabin. He remembered the boots, the hands, the way she screamed his name over and over, and how he did nothing because he was a child, because they held him back, because he had no voice. But now he had rope. Now he had memory. Now he had that dress in his hands. He carried it to the fig tree, laid it across the roots like an offering, and then he began to carve. Not a name, a word. Mother. The sap bled slow. The roots groaned. Caleb closed his eyes and saw his mother's face again, bent, tired, beautiful, and behind her, the man who dragged her away. His name was Nathaniel Greaves. He hadn't been a foreman, not officially. He had been the manager of the house, the civil one, the trusted one, the one who walked freely between big house and quarters, the one who smiled with his teeth while cutting with his hands. And after slavery ended, he stayed, not just stayed, rose. Now he lived in the renovated guest quarters, still managed wages, still signed rations, still issued warnings. He was the last name, the one Caleb had waited for, the rope had waited for, the fig tree had reserved a branch for. That night, Caleb walked to the quarters where Greaves slept, not alone. Behind him came the elders, the mothers, the men who'd lost teeth and time under Greaves' orders, the women who'd wept silently behind closed doors. They came not with torches, not with anger, but with silence, the silence of 30 years. Greaves heard them before he saw them. By the time he opened the door, Caleb stood there, rope in hand, dress in the other. Greaves laughed, a shallow, brittle sound. "It was years ago," he said. "None of you can prove." Caleb dropped the dress at his feet. Greaves looked down and froze. He took a step back, then another. The people closed in, not fast, not wild, just sure, certain, as if justice had finally remembered how to walk. They bound his hands, not cruelly, ceremonially. Caleb led the way. The fig tree waited. The 9th sermon had been loud, but the 10th? It would be sacred. At the base of the tree, Caleb turned to Greaves, held up the rope. The crowd didn't cheer, didn't cry. They watched, like a congregation before a final word. And Caleb, he tied the knot slow, steady, and when it was done, he looked to the tree, to his mother's dress, still lying in the roots, and for the first time since he was a boy, he wept. Then, with one pull, Greaves rose, kicking, silenced, and the branch did not break. 10 names, 10 sermons, 1 tree, and Miriam's blood, still alive beneath the bark, finally rested. They built no gallows. They didn't need to. A simple cart stood beneath the fig tree, wooden, old, the same one that once hauled bales of cotton and broken men. Now, it would hold something heavier, truth. News spread fast. By sunrise, the quarters were empty, not of life, of presence. Everyone had gathered, old men leaning on canes, children held in arms, mothers with faces of stone, fathers with hands that remembered chains. And at the center of it all, Caleb, rope in hand, cart beneath his feet, the fig tree behind him like a cross too tired to fall. The man who stood bound beside the cart was no stranger. His name was Claiborne Hale, a former lieutenant of the Confederate Army, a banker, a philanthropist, and behind closed doors, a collector of scars. 10 years ago, he had come to Tres Montañas under the guise of helping modernize it. He'd overseen efficiency. He'd hired new overseers. He'd kept the workers illiterate and the ledgers forged. And worse, his sins were not shouted, they were known. Every woman flinched at his name. Every man remembered someone who never came back after being called to the house. Now, bound and trembling, Claiborne stood where so many had fallen. But this time, he was the exhibit. Caleb climbed the cart. The wood creaked. He held the rope high, looked out at the faces, and for a moment, just a moment, the silence was so pure, the fig tree seemed to stop swaying. Then Caleb opened his mouth. 30 years of silence behind one word. Witness. The crowd stirred. Eyes widened. Some wept. Some gasped. One word, but it hit like thunder in a sky that had forgotten how to rain. Caleb turned to Claiborne, wrapped the rope, tightened it slow, gentle, ritual. Then, without another word, he kicked the cart. The body dropped. The branch held. And the people, they did not cheer. They bowed their heads, not in sorrow, not in shame, but in solemn memory. Because this was not a killing, this was a sermon, and the fig tree once more had preached. Later that day, they burned the cart, let the ashes scatter across the field. The same field where their parents had bled, where their children would now walk free. And the stump of the cart was buried beneath the fig tree, a new pulpit for a new church, a church of names, a church of no chains, a church where silence had died and memory reigned. The morning after Claiborne Hale swung from the fig tree, the fields did not wake. No roosters crowed, no boots marched, no commands echoed. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was not fear, it was respect, a silence that had weight, that pressed on the chest like a grieving mother, that rolled across the fields like fog after fire. The fig tree no longer groaned. Its limbs were still. Its shadow stretched longer than ever before. And Caleb? He sat beneath it, legs crossed, head bowed, the rope still looped at his side, but not like a weapon, like a relic. From the window of the big house, Colonel Ashcroft watched, gaunt, sickly, half man, half shadow. He had not slept, not since the last rope had dropped. He saw the crowd gather, not in rebellion, in ceremony. Some laid flowers at the base of the tree. Others placed tools, broken picks, old boots, scraps of shirts torn on whipping posts, offerings to the fig tree, to memory, to Caleb. The colonel tried to rise. His legs failed. He crawled to the window, and there he saw Caleb look up, right at him, through the glass, through time, through every excuse and prayer and lie the colonel had ever clung to. Caleb did not smile. He did not scowl. He simply watched, like the earth itself had grown eyes. Later that day, the colonel left the house, walked the grounds alone. No cane, no hat, no pistol. He passed workers. They didn't flinch. They didn't greet. They simply let him pass. At the edge of the quarters, he saw Caleb again. This time, seated on the porch of the chapel. The colonel stopped. They looked at each other for a long time. Finally, the colonel spoke. "What now?" Caleb didn't answer, but his silence was louder than any decree. The colonel turned and kept walking, out of the quarters, out of the fields, out of history. No one followed. No one mourned. That evening the workers gathered for a meal. No one led it. No one had to. Food was passed. Chairs were shared. Laughter returned. Not loud, not careless, but healing. Children played near the tree. The rope had been removed. The branch left bare. But in its bark, the carvings remained. 10 names and one word, witness. Caleb sat in the back. He watched. He listened. And for the first time, he smiled. Just once. Soft, brief, enough. Because after the hanging, even the wind went still. Not from fear, from peace. A peace paid for in silence, in names, in rope. The fig tree still stands, older now, twisted deeper into the earth, its bark thick like armor, its shadow long enough to cover the bones of the past. They say the land changed after the 10th rope, and maybe it did, but what really changed was the people. Caleb lived many more years. He never left Tres Montañas. He never took another life. He never spoke again. Not after that word, not after witness, because sometimes one word is enough. The quarters became homes. Children learned to read, to write, to build. The chapel became a gathering hall, no longer a place for forgiveness, a place for remembrance. Once a year, they gathered at the fig tree, not to mourn, but to remember. They laid stones at the roots, each one carved with a name. Some were old, some were new, but all were real. They built a plaque at the base of the tree. It didn't say Caleb's name. He never wanted it. It said only, "This land speaks." It spoke in silence. It spoke in rope. It speaks in us. Caleb died in his sleep, an old man, at peace. They buried him beneath the fig tree. No headstone, just rope coiled in the roots, and a single carving left in the bark. The word that remained, justice. Today, if you walk through that field, you might miss it. The fig tree blends with the sky. The names are faded, but if the wind is just right, if you're still enough, you might hear it. The creak of a branch, the hush of a crowd, the whisper of a sermon older than the church, and maybe, just maybe, you'll remember a man who never spoke until the world was ready to listen. If this story touched you, leave a like. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it. And if you want more truths like this, subscribe to the channel.